They thought he was just another trespasser, an old black man squatting on condemned land. But when the judge sentenced him to jail, 4 words changed everything. He didn't protest. He didn't beg. He made a call, and what happened next silenced the entire courtroom. This wasn't just a trial. This was a reckoning. And you're about to witness how truth walks into power, and makes it tremble. It began like any other morning at Baystone County Courthouse, a place where stories are reduced to case numbers and names become files on a docket. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of tired people, some desperate for justice, others just hoping to make it to lunch without trouble. Clerks moved through the building with the casual efficiency of routine, their shoes clicking against marble floors. Defense attorneys whispered hurried last-minute instructions to clients. Bailiffs stood stiff by doors, arms crossed, eyes scanning faces for any sign of disruption. No one expected anything unusual. No one thought this day would be any different. Until Leonard Cole walked in. He was 78 years old. His gait was slow, not from weakness but from decades of carrying the world on his back. His shoulders slightly hunched, his hands rough and scarred, but steady. He wore a faded navy work shirt, buttoned all the way to the collar, tucked into tan slacks that had clearly seen better days. His shoes, leather, cracked at the edges, looked like they had walked miles of memories. Leonard removed his flat cap as he stepped through the courtroom doors, a small gesture of respect. But if he expected any in return, he wouldn't find it in this room. The murmurs started almost instantly. Probably another squatter, someone whispered. Why do we waste time with these people? Another scoffed, not softly enough. They didn't know Leonard Cole. Not really. But they had already decided who he was. He had heard it all before, on street corners, in stores, and especially in neighborhoods where a black man with a slow step was seen as something suspicious. He didn't flinch at the words. He never did. He simply kept walking forward, one deliberate step at a time. His eyes were calm. His chin lifted. He had learned long ago that dignity doesn't ask for permission. Behind the bench sat Judge Raymond Castor, 61, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, his robe pressed so sharply it looked starched in stone. He wore the black cloth not like a symbol of justice, but like a shield. A shield he wielded to defend his biases, sharpened over decades of hearing stories he no longer believed. Judge Castor wasn't known for mercy. He was known for control. Known for phrases like, repeat offender, a burden to the system, and perhaps his favorite, people like that. To him, Leonard Cole wasn't a man. He was a case already decided. The only question was how harsh the lesson would be this time. Next, the judge barked, without even lifting his eyes. The bailiff cleared his throat. Case number 881C. The State vs. Leonard Cole. Charged with unlawful presence on restricted city property. Leonard moved toward the defense table alone. No attorney. No advocate. No family waiting in the gallery. Just a man, standing alone in a room that had already made up its mind. Judge Castor finally looked up. What he saw wasn't a former Navy engineer, or a retired disaster relief planner. No. He saw what he wanted to see, an old black man, weathered by time and failure. Someone the system didn't need to explain. Someone disposable. Well, the judge said, leaning back with mock amusement. You again? He opened the file slowly, with the exaggerated flair of someone pretending to care. But he didn't need to read it. His verdict had already been written in the lines between Leonard's wrinkles. You were found trespassing on a condemned lot on Hollow Creek Road, Castor said, his voice soaked in sarcasm. Let me guess, reliving the good old days. Leonard didn't respond. You people always have a story, the judge muttered, flipping through the pages. But sentiment isn't ownership, Mr. Cole. Still, Leonard said nothing. His silence unsettled some in the gallery. Others smirked. But Leonard just stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands folded in front of him. Not pleading. Not ashamed. Just present. "I'll ask again," the judge pressed, now slightly annoyed. "Were you on that property?" Leonard nodded once. "Yes, sir." "And what were you doing there?" Leonard paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he chose every word with care. "I was sitting on the porch," he said, simply. That was it. No defense. No apology. Just truth. Judge Castor scoffed. "The porch of a condemned building. You realize the city owns that land now, right?" Leonard nodded again. "That's what they say, Your Honor. But that house used to be mine." The room shifted, not from noise, but from the sudden tension that fills the air when something doesn't fit. When a man the world had written off refuses to disappear quietly. Judge Castor's smirk faltered, if only slightly. "Used to be," he repeated. "But it's not anymore. So why do you keep coming back?" Leonard breathed in slowly. "Because when I sit there," he said, "it's the only time the world still feels like home." And with that, the room went still. For a moment after Leonard's words, "It's the only time the world still feels like home," there was an eerie stillness in the courtroom. Not peace. No, this was something else. A kind of tension that comes when truth collides with power and refuses to bow. Judge Castor leaned forward, elbows pressing into the polished wood of his bench, his fingers lacing together as if preparing to deliver a sermon. "Feelings," he said, drawing out the word with theatrical disdain, "don't make something legal, Mr. Cole." Leonard said nothing. The judge tilted his head, clearly irritated by the lack of resistance. Most people stammered by now. Begged. Broke. But Leonard? He just stood there calm, unmoving. As if the verdict had already been spoken long before he ever entered the room. "Let me guess," the judge continued, his voice sharpening. "You wanted to sit on that porch and pretend like the world hadn't moved on. Like you still mattered." Still, Leonard said nothing. His silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate. Controlled. And in that silence was something far louder than words. It unsettled the judge. He had seen men collapse under lighter questions. He had seen grown men cry, scream, rage. But not this. Not a man who stood still like he had already made peace with every insult the world had ever thrown at him. The judge tapped his pen on the desk 3 times. Tap. 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 The sound echoed. No one else moved. "You were told to stay away from that property," he said. "Weren't you?" Leonard gave a single, respectful nod. "Yes, sir." "And yet you returned." Another nod. Judge Castor raised an eyebrow. "Why, Mr. Cole? What makes a man your age believe the law no longer applies to him?" Leonard finally spoke, not loudly, not with anger. Just with the kind of quiet clarity that didn't need volume to carry weight. "I never believed the law didn't apply to me," he said. "I just didn't want to forget." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thick. Heavy. Unavoidable. "Forget what?" the judge asked, his voice bordering on mockery. "An old house? A rusted porch swing? That doesn't give you a pass." Leonard remained still. His eyes didn't flicker. His hands didn't tighten. He had already said what needed saying. The silence in the room deepened, stretching longer than anyone was comfortable with. It wasn't a silence of submission, it was the kind that made people fidget in their seats. Whisper to one another. Rethink what they thought they knew. Judge Castor, sensing he was losing his grip on the room, leaned forward again, sharper now. "This courtroom doesn't run on nostalgia," he snapped. "It runs on property rights. On law. And from where I'm sitting, you don't have any." He pointed toward the folder in front of him. No lease. No deed. No legal basis whatsoever. Leonard nodded. That's correct. And yet, you keep returning. Why? This time, Leonard's answer came not as a defense, but as a quiet conviction. Because it was mine before they said it wasn't. There was a shift in the air, subtle but real. You could feel it in the way people adjusted their posture, in the way even the bailiff's hand eased away from the baton at his belt. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't just witnessing a legal proceeding. They were witnessing something human. Judge Castor didn't like it. His eyes narrowed. His voice rose. You think you're here to make some point? You think if you just stand there long enough, I'll see your side? He scoffed. The law doesn't see sides. It sees facts. And the fact is, Mr. Cole, you broke it. Leonard inhaled softly. I didn't break anything, he replied. I just sat down. Another silence. And this time, it was the judge who flinched. He waved a dismissive hand. Sat down to what? Feel sorry for yourself? Feel like a victim? Men like you always have some story to tell. But let me be clear, there's nothing noble about breaking into condemned property. Leonard looked up, calm as ever. I didn't break in. Oh, the judge snapped. You just walked in, like you still owned the place? Leonard nodded. Yes. That's exactly what I did. There was no arrogance in his tone. Just truth. The judge rolled his eyes. Do you have legal representation? No, sir. Did you try to hire one? I don't have the money. Of course not, the judge muttered, almost to himself. From the prosecution table, the assistant district attorney, young, composed, and clearly sensing the discomfort in the room, cleared her throat gently. Your Honor, she said, given Mr. Cole's age and the non-violent nature of the incident, the state is prepared to recommend a fine or community service. Judge Castor turned to her, eyes blazing. You think that's justice? She paused. It's consistent with precedent, she replied. There was no physical altercation. No resistance. The judge drummed his fingers against the bench. Men like him don't learn from slaps on the wrist. And just like that, the room felt colder. But Leonard still stood tall, unmoved. Because what he was about to do next would change everything. Judge Raymond Castor leaned back in his chair with an expression of finality, the kind of look that said, I've already made up my mind. This is just formality now. His fingers tapped the folder again, but this time with a sense of impatience. You're 78 years old, Mr. Cole, he said flatly. At some point, a man stops being a dreamer and starts being a burden. There was a gasp in the gallery. Soft, but sharp enough to cut through the thick courtroom air. Someone even murmured, that's enough. But Judge Castor didn't care. He wasn't speaking for clarity, he was speaking to assert dominance. Leonard didn't blink. His chin remained lifted, eyes steady. He had lived long enough to know when a man's cruelty wasn't personal, it was systemic. He had stood in rooms like this before. Faced voices like this before. This was nothing new. The judge narrowed his eyes. You think this court owes you something? That because you sat quietly and told a nice story, I'm going to let you walk out of here with nothing more than a slap on the wrist? Leonard remained still. His silence didn't come from fear, it came from understanding. A deep, hard-earned understanding that in rooms like this, dignity had to fight harder than guilt. You want us to believe, Castor said with a mocking smirk, that there's something noble about ignoring the law. But there's nothing noble about squatting on government land. Leonard finally looked at him. Calm. Clear. I didn't break in, he said, voice low but sure. Right, the judge mocked. You just strolled in like it still belonged to you. Leonard nodded. Yes. That's exactly what I did. And with that, a hush fell over the room again. The kind that feels like the inhale before a storm. Do you have any legal defense? Any motion to dismiss? Castor asked, voice sharp. No, sir. Did you request public counsel? I did not. Why not? Leonard gave a small shrug. What would I say that you'd listen to? That answer struck harder than anything he'd said so far. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't sarcastic. It was just honest. And somehow, that truth was heavier than any argument. The judge's lips twisted into a smirk. So you want to play the martyr? Is that it? Leonard shook his head slowly. No, sir. I'm just tired of talking where no one listens. Another murmur from the gallery. The assistant district attorney sat a little straighter, sensing it too that this wasn't going the way anyone thought it would. That this case, small on paper, had become something far bigger in spirit. I deal in facts, Mr. Cole, the judge snapped. Not feelings. Not nostalgia. Not these little performances that people like you think will earn them sympathy. Still, Leonard didn't speak. His silence wasn't retreat, it was control. It was the silence of a man who had survived decades of disrespect without ever needing to raise his voice. You ever wonder why people like you don't take responsibility? The judge asked, voice growing louder. Always a reason. Always a story. Always someone else's fault. Leonard raised his head, but not in defiance, in curiosity. Have you ever wondered, he asked quietly, why some people only hear emotion, when they should be listening to history? The words landed like bricks in water, sinking slow, deep, irreversible. Judge Castor's jaw clenched, just for a second. That was the moment. The one where something inside him recognized the truth. But pride, it's a loud thing. And pride doesn't back down just because it's been wounded. I don't care about your history, Mr. Cole, he snapped. No, Leonard said softly. It never is. The room shifted again, not physically, but emotionally. The weight of the judge's words had bounced off Leonard like rain off steel. He was still standing. Still composed. And somehow, that composure, that grace, it felt like rebellion. Judge Castor slammed the folder shut. Let the record show, he barked, the defendant has refused legal counsel, offered no defense, and shown no remorse. Then he looked at Leonard like a man delivering punishment, not justice. For repeated unlawful entry onto restricted property, I hereby sentence Leonard Cole to 30 days in Baystone County Jail. Effective immediately. The words crashed into the room like a thunderclap. The assistant DA froze. The court reporter stopped typing. Even the bailiff flinched. But Leonard? Leonard didn't move. He didn't sigh. He didn't lower his gaze. He just stood there, like he had been expecting this all along. Because he had. And yet what no one realized in that moment was this. Leonard Cole had made one phone call. And that call would change everything. The gavel struck with a force that felt more personal than procedural. 30 days, Judge Castor repeated, his voice echoing through the wooden chamber like a final blow. Take him into custody. But no one moved. The bailiff hesitated, not because he didn't know what to do, but because of how still Leonard Cole remained. Not frozen. Not shocked. Just, still. As if the sentence had passed straight through him, unable to settle anywhere it mattered. There was something about his posture. The way his hands stayed calmly folded. The way his feet didn't shuffle. The way his eyes, though aged and lined with memory, held no fear, only clarity. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't gasp. It just quieted. Because deep down, everyone watching sensed it, this wasn't the end of the story. Judge Castor leaned forward again, irritated by the lack of drama, by the man who refused to react like he was supposed to. Mr. Cole, he said, voice clipped, do you understand your sentence? Leonard looked at him directly. Yes, Your Honor, he said evenly. The judge waited, almost expectantly. Do you have anything to say before this matter is closed? Leonard's gaze didn't waver. No, sir. The judge exhaled sharply through his nose. This proceeding is adjourned. He slammed the gavel again, harder this time, as if trying to seal something into place. Something that felt, inexplicably, like it was already slipping out of his hands. Then, just as the bailiff finally stepped forward, Leonard spoke. His voice was calm. Respectful. Not a protest. Not a plea. Just a request. Before I go, he said, may I make a phone call? It wasn't a demand. It wasn't desperate. It was said with the quiet certainty of a man ticking off a final item from a list. The judge scoffed. A phone call? Leonard nodded. Just one, sir. There was a pause. A shift. A flicker of something unspoken passed across Judge Castor's face, though he buried it beneath a smirk. You're calling a lawyer now? He asked dryly. Bit late for that, don't you think? Leonard didn't react. He didn't offer context. He didn't explain. Just one call. The judge rolled his eyes. Fine. Bailiff, give him your phone. 60 seconds. The bailiff, still a little unsure, reached into his pocket and handed Leonard a black government-issued cell phone. Leonard took it gently. He didn't fumble. Didn't hesitate. Just dialed from memory, no contacts, no names, only numbers burned into his mind like scripture. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Click. And then, Leonard Cole said 4 words. It's time. Bring them. That was it. No names. No threats. No dramatic explanations. Just a sentence. Spoken like a promise. He handed the phone back, nodded with quiet gratitude, and turned again to face the bench. Still calm. Still composed. Still unshaken. But now, something had changed. The room felt different. The air a little denser. The silence heavier. Judge Castor raised an eyebrow. What was that? He asked, trying to sound amused. Leonard said nothing. The judge leaned back, drumming his fingers on the wood again. Your grandkids coming to protest? He asked with a sneer. Still, Leonard didn't reply. Because that call hadn't been a performance for the courtroom. It was a signal. And whatever it had set in motion, it was already on its way. The judge turned to the bailiff with a dismissive wave. Enough of the drama. Take him. But even as he said it, something began to stir. It wasn't noise. It was the absence of it. A strange, collective awareness crept through the gallery. As if everyone suddenly realized that they weren't just watching a sentencing, they were watching the beginning of something else. The bailiff reached out again. But then, from outside the courtroom. Click. 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 High heels. Sharp. Steady. Deliberate. Growing louder. Then the double doors swung open. The room froze. Every head turned. And even Judge Castor, already reaching for the next file, looked up. His eyes widened just a fraction. Because standing at the entrance, framed by the doorway like a shadow before a storm, was her. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She walked through the open doors of Baystone County Courthouse like she belonged there because she did. Every footstep of her black stilettos echoed on the marble floor, not with chaos, but with command. Her silhouette cut through the stunned silence of the room. A sharp black blazer, tailored to perfection. A white blouse beneath it, crisp as her presence. Her posture tall, her expression unreadable, her eyes razor-sharp. She didn't glance at the judge. She didn't acknowledge the murmurs. She didn't need to. Because she wasn't there to seek permission. She was there to correct a mistake. Behind her, 3 men followed. Each one in a designer suit. Each carrying a leather briefcase embossed with gold initials, WGL. Warren, Grant and Leland LLP. One of the most powerful civil rights law firms in the southeastern United States. Even the defense attorneys seated in the gallery straightened up. Even the bailiff stepped back. Even Judge Castor blinked. Leonard didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He had heard those footsteps 1,000 times growing up the sound of purpose. He had made one call. He had said 4 words. And now, she was here. The woman approached the defense table. Her stride didn't waver. Her heels stopped precisely at her father's side. She placed a single hand on his shoulder. It was soft. Steady. Silent. It didn't say, "I'm here to save you." It said, "I've been preparing for this my whole life." Then she turned. Slowly. Deliberately. And faced the bench. Judge Castor stiffened behind his desk. He cleared his throat with manufactured authority. "This court has adjourned," he said, louder than necessary. "If you don't have official business." "I do." Her voice was calm, level, and unshakably firm. "My name is Jacqueline Cole. I'm a licensed attorney, a member of the state bar, and a sitting congresswoman for Georgia's 12th district." The courtroom inhaled as one. She didn't pause for effect. She didn't gloat. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick file, neatly bound, and sealed with a legal sticker bearing the emblem of Warren, Grant and Leland. "I am here to submit evidence," she said, "pertaining to the unlawful sentencing of my father, Mr. Leonard Cole." She didn't toss it. She didn't slam it. She walked it personally to the bench. She placed it in front of Judge Castor with the kind of grace that made silence feel heavy. "Open it," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a threat. It was instruction. The judge hesitated. Just for a second. Just long enough for everyone to notice. He reached forward and flipped it open. The moment his eyes fell on the first page, his jaw tightened. Then came the next page. And the next. And with each line, the color in his face drained. Deeds. Military commendations. Patent records. Land ownership documents. Court-certified evidence showing Leonard Cole was not just not guilty. He was the legal partial owner of the very property he'd been sentenced for trespassing on. The home wasn't condemned. It was under dispute. A bureaucratic error had placed it in the redevelopment zone. But the title? Still listed his late wife's trust and Leonard Cole as successor. Judge Castor blinked 3 times. Then looked up. His voice was smaller now. These weren't submitted during. They will be, Jacqueline cut in smoothly. Filed with the clerk within the hour. Signed. Notarized. Reviewed by 3 independent legal advisors and 2 state-certified title officers. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Because the file wasn't just paperwork. It was a mirror. And what stared back at him was the truth he had refused to see. The man he had called a squatter was a veteran. A homeowner. A father. And now, the father of the woman standing before him with fire in her stillness. Judge Raymond Castor sat motionless, the folder still open in front of him, its pages glowing under the courtroom lights like a silent indictment. His fingers twitched against the wood of the bench, looking for something: control, justification, a way out. But nothing came. "This case has already been ruled upon," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If you wish to challenge the sentence, you may file an appeal." "I'm not here to appeal," Jacqueline interrupted, her tone still calm but sharpened now with steel. "I'm here to correct a miscarriage of justice, one committed right here in this courtroom, by you." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some leaned forward. Others sat back, stunned by the sudden shift of power. No one had ever spoken to Judge Castor like that because no one ever could. Until now. "My father," she continued, her voice unwavering, "was sentenced not for what he did, but for what he looked like. Not for violating the law, but for reminding this court of something it clearly wanted to forget, that dignity doesn't come with a title. It comes with truth." The judge tried to interject, but she didn't let him. "You didn't ask who he was," she said, her voice louder now, building. "You didn't ask why he was there. You didn't pause. You didn't think. You judged." Her words were no longer just for the judge, they were for the room. For the court reporter, whose hands were frozen above the keys. For the bailiff, who now stood a little further from Leonard. For the spectators, who had whispered and chuckled and written him off as a nobody. "You saw an old black man sitting on a porch," Jacqueline said, "and assumed he was a trespasser. Not a veteran. Not a property owner. Not a father. Not a man." The silence after her sentence was deafening. She let it breathe, let it cut through the arrogance still clinging to the judge's robe like a second skin. Then, finally, she stepped back to her father's side. And for the first time all morning, Leonard Cole moved. He looked at his daughter not with surprise, not even with pride, but with a quiet knowing. The kind of knowing that comes from years of preparing your child for battles you hoped they'd never have to fight but knew they one day would. Judge Castor cleared his throat again, softer now. I wasn't made aware of his ownership claim. The initial file didn't." "You weren't made aware," Jacqueline cut in again, "because you didn't ask." Her voice didn't rise. But it landed like a gavel. "You didn't care who he was. You just wanted to clear your docket. Move another body through the system. One more man you could label and discard." She took a step forward. "Well, now you know who he is. And so does everyone else." The room shifted again. Not physically but morally. The balance of power, once so centered on the bench, now rested quietly at the defense table. Jacqueline turned to the bailiff. "I move to have my father's sentence vacated and his record cleared immediately." The bailiff looked toward the judge. So did everyone else. Judge Castor, stripped now of his certainty, nodded once, then twice. "Yes, the motion is granted. Immediately." He turned to the bailiff. "Release Mr. Cole." The bailiff, who had once stood ready to escort Leonard to jail, now stepped back as if from royalty. The cuffs never touched his hands. The chains were never even considered. Leonard remained still. Silent. But this time, the silence didn't feel like invisibility. It felt like victory. Reporters in the back began to scribble furiously. Headlines were already forming. Phones buzzed. Whispered questions passed through the gallery like wind. Did she just say Congresswoman? He owned the house. This is going viral. But Leonard didn't care about any of that. He wasn't thinking about news clips or trending tags. He was thinking about the porch. The wood he had nailed with his own hands. The swing his late wife had painted yellow. The step where he had once taught Jacqueline to tie her shoes. They had called it trespassing. But it had always been home. And now, the world knew it too. Judge Raymond Castor remained seated, but everything about him looked smaller. His robe no longer seemed like a shield. It looked like a costume. His posture slumped, and his fingers gripped the edges of the bench not for poise, but for balance, like a man standing on ground that had just started to crack beneath him. He looked around the courtroom, but no one would meet his eyes. Not the bailiff. Not the prosecutor. Not the gallery. Especially not Leonard Cole. The man he had tried to strip of dignity now stood taller than the bench itself, not in stature, but in something greater, truth. The judge finally spoke, but his voice was different now, lower, no longer laced with command. "Mr. Cole," he began. Leonard didn't respond. He didn't need to. The judge's throat tightened. I deeply regret how this matter was handled. Had I known your history, your service, your ownership. You didn't want to know, Jacqueline said quietly, stepping forward again. Her voice wasn't angry. It didn't need to be. It was clear. Unforgiving. Surgical. You didn't ask. You didn't pause. You didn't wonder if the story in front of you might be bigger than a single piece of paper. She walked to the center of the courtroom now, not pacing, not grandstanding, just occupying space. The kind of space her father had been denied. You saw a problem, not a person, she continued. You saw a man and made a decision based not on law, but on assumption. She turned to face the judge directly. And in doing so, Your Honor, you became exactly what you were sworn to protect us from. The words landed like thunder. Quiet, but undeniable. The room was motionless again, but not from fear. From realization. Every clerk. Every reporter. Every lawyer in that chamber was watching not just a judge, but a man falling apart in real time, under the unbearable pressure of his own blind certainty. Judge Castor's lips parted slightly, but there were no words. His hand reached to adjust his robe, a nervous habit now void of meaning. Leonard Cole finally looked at him. Just one look. And it was enough to crush any illusion the judge had left of being in control. "Do you want to know," Leonard said gently, "what hurt the most?" The judge swallowed hard. "It wasn't the sentence," Leonard continued. "It wasn't the embarrassment. It wasn't even the cuffs you were ready to throw on me." He stepped forward, not with aggression, but with the weight of a lifetime. "It was the look on your face when I walked in. You'd already decided who I was." The judge lowered his eyes. He had no defense. "And that," Leonard added, "tells me all I need to know about how many others you've already sentenced before they've spoken a word." Another beat of silence. Then Leonard said something that made the entire room draw a breath. "You didn't just doubt my story. You erased it." Gasps again, quiet, horrified. The gallery wasn't just watching a correction of legal error. They were witnessing a complete unraveling of moral credibility. Judge Castor sat back, shoulders heavy. "If there's anything I can do to rectify." "There is," Leonard said. The judge looked up, almost hopeful. Leonard didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He just said, "Start listening. Start seeing. Stop assuming." The room froze around him. That wasn't just advice for the judge. That was a commandment for the entire justice system. For every robe behind a bench. Every badge behind a belt. Every pen that signed orders without questions. And for the first time, Judge Castor looked like he understood. Not in his head, in his soul. Because power can hide error for a while. But truth? Truth doesn't ask for permission. It waits. And then, it shows up in a black suit, with a folder and a name the system thought it could ignore. Leonard Cole didn't move at first. He stood at the center of the courtroom, not shackled, not silenced, seen. It wasn't the kind of attention he had asked for. But it was the kind of acknowledgement he had earned. The courtroom, once charged with tension, was now filled with a heavier stillness, the kind that follows revelation. The kind that demands reflection. Jacqueline turned to her father. No words passed between them. She simply held out her hand, not to lead him, not to pull him, but to walk beside him. He took it. And together, they turned to leave. The walk from the defense table to the double doors wasn't long. But it felt like something more than movement. It felt like a procession. A quiet, deliberate reclaiming of space in a room that had tried to erase him. The bailiff stepped back without being asked. The court clerk lowered her gaze, fingers frozen above the keys. Even the prosecutor, young, sharp, and now visibly shaken, stood still, her eyes tracking every step Leonard took like she was watching history unfold. Because she was. When he had walked in earlier that morning, no one noticed. No one cared. To them, he was just another case number. Another tired old man. Now, every pair of eyes in the room followed his exit, not because they were ordered to, but because they couldn't look away. Judge Castor remained seated, fingers steepled in front of him, but the gavel on his desk looked more like a burden now than a symbol of power. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched them leave, knowing that nothing he said could undo what had just happened. As Leonard reached the threshold, he paused. He didn't turn around, he didn't need to. But his voice, low and steady, filled the room one last time. "I was never here to fight," he said. "I just came to sit on a porch, the one I built, with my hands, for my family." A few people in the gallery shifted, some pressing their hands to their mouths. "That house," he continued, "was where I raised my daughter. Where my wife took her last breath. Where my name was carved into the frame before I even knew how to spell it." He tapped his chest lightly. "I don't need a deed to tell me I belong there. The land remembers." That line settled over the courtroom like a hymn. And then, he walked through the door's shoulders back, steps slow but strong. Not like a man leaving court, but like a man returning to his name. Outside, the sun had shifted. The marble steps leading down from Baystone County Courthouse were now lined with reporters, photographers, and bystanders, most of them drawn not by spectacle, but by truth. As Leonard and Jacqueline stepped into the light, a hush fell over the crowd. Not because anyone told them to be quiet, but because some moments don't need narration. One reporter stepped forward, notebook in hand. "Mr. Cole, do you have a statement?" Leonard looked out over the gathering. His face was calm. His eyes clear. And he said, "For a long time, I thought silence was survival. That if I kept my head down and did the right thing, the world would see me for who I am." He paused. "But the world doesn't see, unless it's forced to." Another breath. Then, "I didn't come here looking for a fight. I came to sit on a porch. The porch where I learned what it means to belong." He turned to Jacqueline. Then looked back at the crowd. "They tried to take my place. My name. My history. But what they didn't know, is that I've spent my life building something stronger than any courtroom." He tapped his chest again. "It's in here." The cameras clicked. Reporters leaned in. But Leonard didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He finished like a man who knew this moment was never about vengeance. It was about truth. "I hope the next Leonard Cole," he said, "doesn't need a daughter in Congress to be believed." That line didn't just land. It echoed. And with that, he stepped down the courthouse stairs, Jacqueline by his side. They didn't look back. Because some stories don't need to be rewritten. They just need to be heard. The moment Leonard Cole and his daughter stepped out of the courthouse, the world caught fire. What began as a local misdemeanor hearing had transformed in real time into a national reckoning. Reporters pushed past each other for quotes. Camera crews sprinted to get front-row angles. Social media platforms lit up like lightning striking dry ground. Within minutes, hashtags trended, hashtag Leonard Cole, hashtag Justice Misjudged, hashtag Porch That Spoke. Hashtag Dignity on Trial. On screens across the country, the narrative was no longer about trespassing. It was about legacy. About assumption. About a courtroom that nearly erased a man's entire life without ever asking who he was. Veteran wrongfully sentenced in Georgia court, saved by daughter's surprise intervention, read the CNN headline. Congresswoman destroys judge's ruling in live courtroom standoff, buzzed a YouTube thumbnail. He built the porch they said he didn't belong on, was reposted with a photo of Leonard walking down the courthouse steps, hand in hand with Jacqueline. But inside the courtroom? Inside the chamber where power had so comfortably rested for decades? It was quiet again. Too quiet. Judge Raymond Castor hadn't moved. The courtroom was nearly empty now. The bailiff had retreated. The clerk was collecting paperwork with trembling fingers. Even the prosecutor had slipped out hunched over her phone, no doubt already fielding calls from superiors. But the judge? He just sat there. Still cloaked in his robe. Still staring at the bench. But no longer certain it belonged to him. The gavel sat untouched to his right. But it didn't feel like a symbol of authority anymore. It felt like evidence. Evidence of the sentence he had delivered without compassion, without context, without curiosity. He had judged Leonard Cole before the man said a word. And now, the world knew. He shifted in his seat and looked out over the gallery now mostly empty. But the echo of Jacqueline's voice still lingered. You didn't see a father. You didn't see a man. You saw a problem. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. Removed his glasses. Ran his fingers across the stack of papers Jacqueline had left. They were still there. Still legal. Still damning. Because this wasn't about one bad ruling. It was about what the ruling revealed. That sometimes the ones enforcing justice are the most blind to its absence. Outside, Leonard Cole stood quietly beneath the courthouse steps. He wasn't giving interviews. He wasn't soaking in attention. He was just present. Still. Solid. The way he had been all morning. Jacqueline stood beside him, fielding questions with the grace of someone who had walked through fire before. But every now and then, she'd glance over at her father. Just to check. Just to reconnect. Because they both knew. This moment wasn't about a headline. It was about healing. Someone handed Leonard a small stool so he could sit. He didn't take it. I've spent too long being told to sit down, he said gently. I'll stand. And that quote? That one went viral in under 5 minutes. The sun had started to shift in the sky, casting longer shadows. But Leonard remained in the light. Not metaphorically. Literally. And people began to gather. Not to chant. Not to riot. Just to watch. Because what they were witnessing wasn't spectacle. It was the return of someone who had been denied visibility his whole life finally, undeniably, seen. Back inside, Judge Castor stood slowly. He picked up his gavel as if it might explain something to him. It didn't. He turned toward the empty witness stand and whispered, I never asked who he was. But the wood didn't respond. The bench didn't absolve. The silence didn't forgive. And for the first time in his career, Judge Raymond Castor realized. He had handed down a sentence not just to a man. But to himself. Because mistakes in a courtroom live longer than memory. They echo. And Leonard Cole? He was no longer a case number. He was a mirror. The sun had begun its descent by the time Leonard and Jacqueline reached the end of the courthouse steps. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The hard part was over. But the message had just begun to spread. Across the street, a muralist had already started sketching the outline of Leonard's silhouette onto the side of a nearby building. Below it, a quote was being written in bold charcoal strokes, I didn't come here to fight. I came to sit on a porch. Dozens of people were gathered quietly, watching as history was immortalized in brick and paint. One little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, Mom, who is he? The mother leaned down and whispered, someone who didn't back down. The boy stared, wide-eyed. And nodded. Inside the courthouse, Judge Castor remained at his bench long after everyone else had gone. He didn't even notice when the janitor arrived to sweep the gallery floor. The weight of it all had settled into his bones, not just the embarrassment, not even the scandal, but the realization of how small he had been in the presence of something so much larger than his authority. He had wielded law like a weapon. And Leonard Cole had carried truth like a torch. One had shattered. The other had lit the room on fire. Back home, Leonard sat on the porch. Not the one in court, not the one the city tried to strip from him. The real one. The one he built 46 years ago with the savings from his first Navy contract and a bag of second-hand tools. The swing creaked softly in the wind. The paint was chipped. The wood was tired. But it was his. He didn't need the cameras. He didn't need the articles. He just needed this. A quiet place. A view of the street. The feel of old wood under his hand. Jacqueline stepped out with 2 mugs of tea. She handed him one and sat beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. And then, Leonard said, "I didn't think they'd listen." Jacqueline smiled. "They didn't. Not at first." He nodded. "But they saw." "Yes," she said. "They saw you. A beat. And they can't unsee it now." Across the country, something shifted. It wasn't policy, not yet. But it was something deeper. Something personal. A judge in Mississippi paused longer before delivering a ruling. A young public defender in Chicago clipped Leonard's quote and taped it to her desk. A teacher in Portland used the story to explain bias to her 7th graders. And in Baystone County, the courthouse launched a full review of its judicial training and racial bias protocols named the Cole Reforms. Because one man stood still. One man didn't flinch. And the silence he carried in that courtroom was louder than any gavel could ever be. A week later, Jacqueline stood in front of Congress. Not as a daughter. Not as a lawyer. But as a representative of a movement that had just begun to grow. She closed her speech with the same words her father had whispered that night on the porch: "I just wanted to sit on the steps of the house I built. The house where my wife laughed. Where my daughter learned to walk. Where my name is carved into the bones of the walls. I didn't trespass." I remembered. The chamber fell silent. But it wasn't a silence of apathy. It was a silence of recognition. Because they knew some for the first time what dignity looks like when the world tries to erase it. And still, it stands. Leonard Cole didn't win by shouting. He didn't win with force. He won by knowing exactly who he was even when the world refused to look. So the next time someone walks into a room, dressed in humility, carrying nothing but memory and truth, pause. Ask. See. Because the strongest voices in history often arrive without a sound. And when they do, the world never stays the same again. Sometimes the strongest protest is silence. And the deepest justice comes not from revenge but from being seen. Leonard Cole's story wasn't just about a wrongful sentence. It was about a system that's grown too comfortable judging people by what they look like instead of asking who they are. He didn't come to fight. He didn't come to plead. He simply came to sit on the porch he built with his own hands. But the world saw a problem, not a person. And through his stillness, his grace, and his truth he taught us all a lesson we cannot forget. Lesson 1: Never judge a person by their appearance. Truth doesn't live in court files, it lives in the questions we fail to ask. Every person carries a story worth hearing. And when we ignore that story, we aren't just being careless, we become complicit in injustice. Lesson 2: Silence is not weakness. It's strength that has learned patience. Leonard never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Because dignity doesn't yell, it stands. His stillness shook the room harder than any protest ever could. Lesson 3: legacy isn't built through power but through character. He had no title. No lawyer. No platform. But he had something greater: the truth. And when truth walks into a courtroom, no robe is thick enough to cover the shame of having ignored it. Lesson 4. Justice doesn't require applause, only perseverance. He didn't seek fame. He didn't seek pity. He simply wanted to be seen. And when he finally was, it forced an entire system to confront its reflection. Because real justice isn't when we win. It's when those who've been invisible are finally acknowledged. Final lesson: start listening before the silence becomes too loud to bear. Because there are countless Leonard Cohls standing at the doors of institutions that have already made up their minds. And the question we must ask ourselves is this: will we see them as a threat or as a story worth knowing?